Hi everybody, I'm Nicole Vulcan, editor of The Source Weekly, and why don't you introduce yourself and tell everyone why you're running?
Thanks. My name is Melanie Kebler. I'm running for Bend City Council position 1. I grew up in Bend. I graduated from Bend High in 2001, moved away for college and law school, and came back here a couple years ago to raise my daughter and be closer to my family, because I consider Bend my hometown. Once I got back here, I got kind of involved in the local scene and our local government, and what I saw from our city council is it didn't feel to me like they were listening to all the voices in the community on some of the key issues that we're facing as a city. And so that kind of inspired me to run and to see if we can get some fresh perspective and new voices on our council this year. I'm an attorney and I'm a former prosecutor. And so in my work, I work very closely with crime victims. And then I went on to become a victims' rights attorney for a nonprofit called the Oregon Crime Victims Law Center. In that job, one of the skills that I had to perfect was being able to listen to people and help them be heard in a complicated system that they may not understand. And I want to take those skills to our council and make sure that we're really engaging with our community on the challenges that we're facing as a city.
Great. So we're in the middle of a global pandemic, as much as I think all of us wish we weren't. How has the position of city councilor changed as the pandemic rolls on?
I definitely think that the city government has a role to play in responding to the pandemic. Understanding we're not the federal government, we're not the state government, but especially in messaging to our residents about what's safe and what guidelines to follow, and looking at regulations within the city, perhaps on short-term rentals, people visiting here, making sure people follow those safety protocols. So there's a couple of places that I would have taken some action and where our current city council didn't. One of those is back in April when they had the chance to enforce some regulations on short-term rentals that the city manager had already advised. And I would have voted to do that. And I also would have voted to continue to keep checking on that. Because it is obviously a very dynamic situation. We keep learning more every day. The numbers keep changing and we need to be up on the data and what's happening. And I think meeting more regularly, maybe than City Council usually meets, can also help with responding to this type of a kind of a dynamic crisis that's occurring. Another issue that I would have voted differently ultimately than the City Council did is the vote to protect hotel workers with some regulations that came up a couple of weeks ago during an emergency meeting. I'm glad they held the emergency meeting and took some time to discuss and address it. Ultimately, I think I would have voted to take that decision to keep some of those vulnerable workers protected in our community as much as we can as a city. So those are a couple places I would have done something a little bit more than the City Council did, but I am glad that there has been some response and there has been, at least one emergency meeting to try to address what really is an emergency and a crisis for us right now.
Mm-hmm. So this touches on some of the things that you already mentioned, but what does leadership look like for a city councilor today?
I think leadership, it starts really with that kind of engagement and really being able to make people feel heard. And that means you have to be accessible in some ways. We do have to recognize these are volunteer positions, basically. There's a very small stipend that's involved. Most people wouldn't be able to do this without working or without support from their partner or some other resources. But at the same time, being visible in the community, being a person that can build trust with different groups in the community. And in my experience as a person that's working for a nonprofit, I opened our one-person office here and had to kind of go around, find who are the community partners and stakeholders, get to know them, build trust with them, understand where I can be involved and where we can refer and work together. That type of thing is the thing that a city councilor can do too, with other government agencies or with community groups. And part of that is showing up and being there and being someone that people are familiar with who you are. They know that you will listen. They know that you will take their call. And even if you end up disagreeing, ultimately, they know that they can at least be heard. And I think that's a big piece of leadership for kind of a local government position.
Mm-hmm. So you touched on this already as well, but I'll ask it again just to give you another opportunity to look at it a different way. What should the city's position on tourism be as the pandemic appears to be stretching into 2021?
Yeah, I think it's a really tough question because as a city, we do receive a lot of revenue from short-term room taxes, and that's a big part of our budget that is in our discretionary bucket, basically, that we can spend on projects, or a lot of it goes to police and fire and other kind of services that the city provides. So we got to balance that with, is there an issue with visitors coming here and potentially putting the community at risk, or being at risk themselves by traveling to our community? It's pretty tough. I've been closely watching the meetings and the information they've been receiving, and there isn't a direct link between, people visiting here and then our numbers going up. But there isn't, data to say that that's not happening either. It's just kind of still unknown. And in that situation, I want to try to keep our community safe as possible. I think, for instance, the move to create a civil fine for not following the rules for masks is a step in the right direction to really help with that strong message that we're advising you not to come, right now just because of the pandemic. If you are here, you need to follow the rules that help keep all of us safe. And especially as we learn more about how effective masks are and how the virus is transmitted, I think that's crucial to really take those steps. It's going to be really difficult to kind of shut the doors and be like, don't anybody come here. So we have to acknowledge that's happening and take those steps to keep people safe.
So we're going to just jump all over the place here today. So different topic. What's your position on and ideas around the upcoming transportation bond? Your position on it going forward on the ballot this fall, as well as your view on the specifics of the bond itself.
Sure. Okay, so I'll start with putting it on the ballot. I agree with the decision to place it on the ballot in November. I was supportive of it back in May before it was taken off the ballot. And part of that reason is I think this is a question that needs to go to Bend voters, and we need to hear from them. And in a November election that we're having this year, we're going to have pretty good voter turnout, I believe. And that means we're going to get a hopefully wide swath of the voting base weighing in on this question and letting us know if they think this is the right direction we should go to invest in our transportation system. If it's moved to May, those are typically much lower voter turnout. I wish it was higher, but it's just kind of the way the world is right now. And I would worry that we would not be getting enough of a cross-section of the community to really get a good feel for, is this the way we should be going? The project list, I think, is a result of a lot of really hard work and a lot of work from people on different perspectives to kind of find something that they could all agree on. And I think that's good. I wouldn't personally have the exact same project list if it was just me deciding, but that's part of, that base of public involvement and community engagement to get to that point, and recognizing who are those partners that we need to bring on board for a project that, a bond that is this big. So I am supportive of it. I want to prioritize on council the projects that we can start with that are lower cost and also get people out of their cars. So things like bike lanes and things like that don't cost as much as road widening, but can make a difference as we start to transform, hopefully, our transportation system. So I think there are things in there a little bit for everyone. Not everyone is super happy with it, but there are places we can start moving forward and really making that investment we need to make to kind of catch up with our transportation system.
So Ben just went through a pretty significant event that made national news last week. What's your assessment of the city and the city police's handling of the recent ICE and immigrant detainment situation? And specifically, do you believe it was appropriately handled by the city and the city police department?
So I was present for part of the day and part of the night of that activity down in the Box Factory Old Mill area. And when I first got down there, I think I was getting down there just as the Bend Police in kind of tactical gear, the CERT team, were leaving. And then I came back down later and was present for Chief Krantz's statement, and then when the federal agents came. So I got to at least witness some of it. I haven't spoken directly to anyone in the police department. From what I could see, they were generally staying back. I saw them talking with protest leaders and things like that. I think some things went well and some things didn't, as far as just the crowd management. I think the biggest mistake, and I know that Chief Krantz has spoken to this, was having those folks show up with rifles and sort of the full gear on. I think that changed the feeling of the crowd and maybe was a mistake to do that. It didn't feel necessary. There was nothing I saw there that was volatile or violent. Everyone was peaceful and working very hard to stay peaceful, and I really appreciated that from our community. Everyone has a right to stand up for your neighbors in that way, but keeping it peaceful like that it just made me really proud that we were able to do that as a community. I appreciated that there were a few elected officials that came down, including Jenna and Barb from the city did come down, and then Mayor Russell was down briefly as well when Chief Krantz gave his statement. It was a dynamic situation. There was a lot of information flying around, especially on social media. I appreciate that I've heard that our city officials, and I think John Hummel as well, were trying to work with DHS to find a resolution. That I learned mostly about that after the fact. That wasn't really being communicated real time. with the crowd. And I know it's hard, but I mean, I think some of that transparency and communication earlier on in the day would have been great, just to help people understand what the city could and couldn't do. I really do not want any local resources spent on immigration detention enforcement, which is the law in Oregon. And so I have sent some questions in, especially that I saw on a live stream, and other people confirmed that there were ICE agents in Bend police cars. And I want to explore, whether that is something that we should be doing in the future. Even does that violate the law? I know Chief Grant says that he doesn't believe it does. I'd like to continue to explore what are the policies that we can put in place to help the community understand that the city does take it seriously as far as keeping our immigrant neighbors safe and our undocumented neighbors safe. And I would like to see continued messaging and continued work on that from the city. I think that's what the community is demanding right now. So I think, there were pros and cons to how the city was involved. I am glad that we are a city where the police were not assisting the federal agents directly. They weren't standing with them like I have observed in other cities this year. They weren't directly, tactically coordinating with them that I could see. But there was some moments that I have some questions about where there was potentially the local resources that were spent. I also sent a question to Chief Grants about how much did that cost our city to have all those police there, right, to respond to that call for service from DHS. What was the budgetary impact there? Those are the real things that happen when our federal government takes these actions. And so my concern also is for the due process rights of everyone in Bend, no matter if you have committed a crime or you haven't. You should have a right to due process. You should have a right to transparency from our federal government. And your family should know where you're going when you're taken off the street into a bus like that. And so I really identify with the community that has huge concerns about that type of behavior from our federal government, for sure. And that's part of why I was down there.
If you had been a sitting city councilor at that time, what would you have done at that moment?
I think I would have come down and tried to speak with people. I think I would have been trying to gather information, work with the mayor and other city councilors to find out what we could find out and pass on to people so that they knew as much as we did about what was going on, what the city could and couldn't do in that situation. And I saw, especially DA Hummel, who stayed around for quite a while, having some tough conversations with people that were maybe upset with him or had really hard questions. And I would hope that I would also be willing to engage in those hard conversations. It's not pleasant, especially in a crowd, to have people maybe yelling or upset, but I think it is a duty of an elected official to try to at least speak with your community and answer questions as best you can. You're not always going to have all the answers, but again, that showing up and being willing to listen, I think goes a really long way in building trust with people in the community. And even in moments that are kind of dynamic and as fraught as that was, it's something that I think leaders can do and that I would have done.
Mm-hmm. Sort of another prong of this. Do you feel like the city is doing enough to support diversity, equity, and inclusion? And if not, what would you do?
I do appreciate that the city's set some DEI goals. I would like them to be stronger. I also can appreciate that they did, as a majority, vote for the Human Rights and Equity Commission this week to start forming that commission, as was requested by the task force of people that came together to work on that issue and see what can the city do. That's a step forward, but it's not the only step. I really want us to set strong goals that look both internally to city culture and how the city government works and where we can root out systemic racism within our own kind of workings as a city, as well as external goals about leading in the community, bringing people together, engaging with communities we haven't engaged with before, and reducing some of those barriers to accessing the government from our city. I think we really need to rethink our public comment and our public engagement and get more creative about how we try to get feedback from folks instead of expecting them to come to us in a kind of a narrow window of a city council meeting or other types of meetings. I'm encouraged to hear they're looking into kind of these listening sessions and other types of ideas where you actually go out and say, hey, we just want you to tell us how you're feeling. I think that's a really good start as well. But I think we really have to have a strong commitment from our leadership that the city itself should be an anti-racist organization, and what can we do to move us to get on that path, basically.
Mm-hmm. Where do you stand in the debate to defund the police, and would you support transferring some city funds from cops to social services?
Yeah, I think that cry to me really talks about where are we allocating our resources as a city, which means where are our priorities. And I've been moved to do a little research. I read a book called The End of Policing, which I think the publisher made that free this year, which was great. But just to get the idea, like, what would it look like? Where did we come from with our police force now? And what would it look like to have a totally different rethinking of policing? So, I support, and I think I have heard from some of the folks in our department, our police department, that they support as well, like moving some of these resources to, especially in the area of responding to mental health, having a different model of response in that area. It's been proven, I think, that improves outcomes for people. And I think hopefully our police department will agree that they don't want to be sent to calls where they don't have the resources to deal with it, right? We need professionals and experts to be going to the calls so that they can actually help the person instead of it potentially escalating into something that's tragic. So I mean, I don't think I would agree with let's just get rid of our police department right now, but I think the movement is towards where can we find places where we don't need an armed officer to respond. Another one would be in traffic enforcement, which is historically, disproportionate with racial profiling, even intentional or not, bias in policing. And I think we can look at, can we go to speed cameras or red light cameras or things that are not involving an officer, so you don't have that moment of potential tragedy with someone who's carrying a gun walking up to a car. So I think I want to explore those types of things, because then we can focus on having the police do the work where they're needed and having the resources for those other problems spent elsewhere.
So let's jump to a totally different topic now. Again, I want to talk about growth, which brings a lot of challenges for Bend. What do you see as the top 2 challenges facing Bend in regards to growth, and what would you propose to deal with those challenges?
Yeah, I think our growth has really revealed our challenges in our transportation system and in our housing market, in our housing stock here in Bend. So on transportation, I do think we need that big investment to get us going on improving our system so that it works better for everybody in Bend. And then on the housing side, we are still in a housing crisis. We're still seeing our average, go up every year, and it's not attainable for a lot of people in Bend. I was talking to a couple of friends who are architects, and they kind of pointed out there's not really a lot of starter homes in Bend. Like, how do you enter into being a homeowner in Bend? We don't have that market here yet. And so I want to encourage not only affordable housing projects, which are so important, but moving towards getting that missing middle, those kind of 80 to 120% of the median income housing that are the starter homes or a townhome or a condo or those things that people can kind of start there on their income, and people that live here are also working here, right? So that we're not putting that strain on our transportation system as well. So I think that's what I want to push for. I think the city has done some good things in setting some goals on getting housing units done. I'm really encouraged, and I totally support all the code changes that are coming in under House Bill 2001 that allow for all these different types of housing, micro units, tiny homes, duplexes and quadplexes, and I want to see how can we incentivize those to be built more often and really kind of fill out that middle. Because I think that's the only way that we're really going to be able to address the problem of people continue to move here, we are going to continue to grow, and people need affordable places and accessible places to live. The other thing I want to throw in there is childcare. Childcare is a huge issue in Bend. We're in a childcare desert, and the pandemic has had a really horrible, hard effect on our childcare providers. And so I think the city does have a role to play there and has started to kind of pick up that role. I want to continue that and see how do we make it easier for childcare providers here in Bend to own and operate, basically. How do we encourage more of them to come? I mean, I waited over a year and a half, I think, on a list to even start taking my kid to daycare, and she's not going anymore because they don't have the slots. And also it's, I don't want to risk community spread. So it's a real challenge, and it's something else I think we can take a stance on, and I think that's part of the growth challenge as well. So.
For sure. So you mentioned the missing middle, and we have another question here, and these are questions that are assembled by our editorial board, and we're asking the same ones of everyone. So I want to at least touch on this question, even though you did cover it a little bit, talking about the missing middle. But in regards to affordable housing, what concrete actions would you take to address housing for low and middle income wage earners?
Sure. So
kind of a repeat.
Yeah, no, that's okay. So I think we have a really good affordable housing committee that does great work on getting the funds that we can get for that low income housing out to great projects in our community. I want to continue that. I want the city to be a really active lobbyist for those funds to come here. For sort of that middle income, I think we need to look at our code, some of those code changes that I just talked about, but also just going through our code in general. Where are some of the barriers that make some of these multifamily housing projects not quite pencil out? One thing that I have discussed and I recently gave a public comment on was parking minimums, where you're required to build parking spaces to go with your housing. And I'm in favor of reducing or eliminating those wherever we can, especially in the core where we're trying to have a little bit more of a density, mixed-use housing market come in, because they're expensive and they take up space that could be used for housing, and they can be a barrier to making a project actually pencil out and go forward. So I think we need to look at that. We need to look at our permitting process and how we can streamline that so that we can get things built quickly and have as few delays as possible. And then I've also, this is a little wonky, but in talking, part of what my process is I talk to people that know more than I do to try to learn. And one of the things I've heard about is having the ability to actually get capital to build some of these different types of housing projects, and that lenders are a little bit more wary to lend on those versus a single family housing. And I wonder if the city has some role to play with partnering with the chamber or other organizations and seeing if we have some local banks that would be willing to say, okay, every year we'll give X amount of dollars out for folks that are building these types of projects, and just try to stimulate getting that different housing built. I think we can get creative, and there's some ways that we can try to find that incentive for developers to build something other than just only single family homes.
Interesting. So kind of related, hundreds of people are still living in encampments and houseless in their cars and things in Bend. This seems to be a top issue for Bend voters. What is your position on the city's role in establishing an established camp for houseless folks?
Yeah, the city just received a presentation on that this week, and it mostly had to do with the new law that our state passed to kind of lower some barriers to getting some of that type of shelter space built, and I'm all for that. I think the city really needs to commit to serving our houseless population. One, showing compassion for these are our neighbors, and it's not okay to just think of them as a problem to be shoved out of sight, right? We need to address the root problems, and we need to help people get on the path where they don't have to live in a way that's dangerous to them or to others. So I absolutely think we need to invest in as much shelter space as we can get in Bend. It means partnering with nonprofits. It means lobbying for money to do that, or finding money in our budget to do that. It means taking advantage of some of these new laws that are going to be coming down to encourage that, and really moving quickly to get it established. I think I'm hoping to see that I think this year we'll probably have another temporary warming shelter. I would like us to have a permanent warming shelter. I mean, it's cold every winter, and we have the same problems for our houseless neighbors, and we really need to commit to getting that established and be a full partner on that. So that's something that I would definitely push for as a counselor. I think it's imperative, and I understand why people are worried about the issue, for their neighbors here in Bend.
Talking about city council members, and you mentioned already that it's essentially a volunteer position, a couple $100 thrown in there. Mm-hmm. Do you believe that the city council, as well as people serving on committees, should be paid a living wage for their service?
I do think that we should look at what we pay our city councilors. I just have been watching so closely to what the city council does, what their meetings are like, what the issues are in front of them. And we're at 100,000 people now in Bend. I mean, it might be time to rethink, how does our local government be effective and responsive, and how do we attract a wide swath of people to want to participate and even run for council or be a part of that local government. And right now, it's limited. It's limited to people that have the time, the resources, the money, frankly, to take the head of coming to these meetings and going to other subcommittee meetings and being involved. And if we can provide that living wage or that base wage for people that take on this role, I think we're going to see a lot of different people stepping up. And I think that would be great. So that's where I come from on that, is that let's make that base, that stable base for people to say, okay, you know, I'll be able to work half-time at my job and do the city council thing and still make my rent or still pay my house payment, and so it's viable for me. I can step up. I think for committees, I absolutely support stipends for committee members that need them to be able to participate on those committees. Again, I want to see a wide swath of our community participating, and that's one of the barriers that we can help to lower. Other things like remote meetings, providing technology to people that need it to participate, looking into childcare provisions for folks that have kids but also want to participate on some committees that regularly meet. I think that's really important too. So I do support, maybe we need like the next step for our local city government at this point with where we're at in Bend.
Mm-hmm. So we're getting close to the end.
Yeah.
I have one more question for you before I want to give you the opportunity to bring up anything you want to bring up.
Sure.
So this is, name one critique of the city council and describe what you would do differently.
Yeah, I think I've spoken a couple of times on the COVID response and where I would have pushed for something different than what the city council ultimately arrived at. I think there's several places where me and my opponent have differed on votes. Doesn't mean that sometimes when he votes no, the city council is majority voting for what I would have voted for anyway, so I don't know that it would have made a huge difference. But I think those are the main areas. I mean, I do appreciate how we have responded to the pandemic as a city council, but I think there have been some missed opportunities to really message, to really respond, I guess, quicker than our usual meeting schedule, and to really take some leadership roles on protecting people in town, and mainly those two votes and some of the periods of time where people were saying, well, what, you know, things are happening in the data and there's not a meeting for like 3 weeks, you know. I know it's a tough situation, but I would have liked to see a little bit different response in those ways and on those two votes in particular.
Cool. So now I just want to give you the chance to bring up anything that we haven't covered, and then also just, you know, remind people why they should vote for you.
Sure. I think the only thing we haven't covered is climate change and environment, and so I do want to touch on that. I'm supportive of our community action plan to take on the climate change problem. I think we need to go further. I think we need to set big goals there. And I really want Bend to become a leader in the fight on climate. And I think it makes sense for where we live and how important our environment is, just to our ecosystem, but also to our local economy. So that's one big issue that, you know, I want to push for, and I will use that climate lens in a lot of decision making on council. And yeah, I think people should vote for me because I think we need some new voices on our council. I think we need to have a council that reflects the values of people in Bend, that reflects a little bit more of the diversity of people in Bend, and which is why I'm proud to be running with a great group of candidates that are running for the 4 seats that are open. And I'm really excited about what we can accomplish as a council that aligns with the values of Bend and really cares about Bend's future, and making sure that we're planning in a way that really has our future benefiting everyone who lives in Bend.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Melanie.
Yeah, thank you.